Okay, folks, welcome back. Welcome to session number 3. My name is still Elizabeth Bice, and I'm a leading member of Socialist Action and chair of the panel on the topic Eco-Catastrophe or Eco-Socialism. Canada is on fire, and the choices facing society are very stark. To elaborate on this theme, we are delighted to have the following speakers, Angela, Stephen, and Tom. So, our first speaker, Angela Bischoff, has worked with the environmental nonprofit sector for more than 3 decades in 4 Canadian cities on issues ranging from eco-sites, transportation, climate, mental health, and elections. She is the director of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, a small but mighty group aiming to move Ontario to a 100% renewable path. She also practices and teaches yoga, commutes daily by bike, and cares for her aging mother. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you, everybody. Flo and Barry and Julius and everybody. So I will just share my screen. And I look forward to your questions. Whoops. So we were to talk about eco-catastrophe or eco-socialism, and I'm just going to focus on eco-catastrophe, and the other 2 speakers are going to focus on eco-socialism. That's what I was told. So I hope that's okay with you. I'm really just going to talk about eco-catastrophe. And I work with the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, as Flo mentioned. It's an NGO, small. It was formed in 97 to call for the coal phase out. And we're still small. And we won that campaign in 2014. The last lump of coal was burned for electricity purposes here in Ontario. And we then turned our attention to moving Ontario to a 100% renewable future. And I'm going to talk about that today. So eco-catastrophe, major disruptive upset in the balance of nature. Not always caused by humans, but we're going to talk about human-caused eco-catastrophes here today. And the 2 that I think are the most important that I want to address today, though I'm sure some of you would have different ones, is I'm going to talk about climate change and nuclear annihilation. So climate change, yeah, like, I don't know, did you see the article from last week that it was so hot in Mexico? It was only like 45 degrees. And, much of the well, not only the southern much of the planet right now is undergoing a massive heat wave. India, Bangladesh, a lot of those southern countries are over 50 degrees temperature. And, I don't know, my mom melts in -25. I have to keep her in air-conditioned spaces. So old people and vulnerable people cannot handle heat like that. So Mexico has been around 45 degrees, and it was so hot that literally monkeys, birds, and bats were falling dead from trees. So the animal kingdom can't manage, plants can't. And Canada last year was the record wildfire season. It was twice that of the previous record, which was 1989. So, the trajectory of climate induced weather catastrophes and droughts and wildfires is just, if you see the trajectory, it's just going up and up, warmer. And oceans too are facing, really severe threats. And right now we're talking extreme heat, oxygen loss, and acidification. So, we're in the midst of a massive, it's known as the 6th mass extinction. Plants and animals are going extinct at a rate of 1,000 to 10,000 times more the natural rate of extinction. So, industry has known that the climate was changing and that the burning of fossil fuels was causing it. They've known this for decades, ever since, the 50s and before. And they kept that research to themselves. And now, now states in the United States and European states are starting to actually sue the oil and gas industry for what they knew and how they've suppressed that sort of research and continued to, push fossil fuels. And then, nuclear annihilation, that is also very vulnerable. We are in a very vulnerable state right now with some 12,000 nuclear weapons around the world, many weapon states, and it's growing now with the threat of, the Russian imperialism is forcing lots of different European countries. Now they want nuclear weapons because they see what's happened to Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear weapons. And nuclear power and nuclear weapons are very closely aligned. In fact, Macron, the president of France, he has been explicit in this. Most state leaders have been a lot more moot on this point, and they don't like to associate it. But Macron essentially said that without a nuclear power industry, we wouldn't have a nuclear weapons industry, because it creates the jobs, the research for the nuclear weapons industry. It provides a cover for nuclear weapons. Oh, why am I not? What's going on? So, given those two really important issues that we're facing globally, what is happening in Canada? I'm going to bring it down to Ontario. In the midst of a climate crisis, in the midst of, pressures, nuclear war pressures, we have Doug Ford doubling down on ramping up gas and nuclear reactors. To such a degree, the nuclear program, nowhere in the world have we ever seen a nuclear program that we are seeing right now in Ontario. And, for those of us who are in Ontario, we don't realize how out of step it is for the rest of the world. But all of the nuclear plans that Doug Ford is committing Ontarians to at this point is about $177 billion. There has been no public conversation about these massive infrastructure programs, or no conversation whether we should be going nuclear or should be going renewable. There's no public conversation about it, no opportunity for us to engage in the process. But basically, they're rebuilding all of our aging nuclear infrastructure, which is 18 nuclear reactors. We're already the second most nuclearized jurisdiction in the world, second only to France. And now the largest nuclear station in the world is the Bruce nuclear station with 8 reactors. They're rebuilding all 8, and they essentially want to double the size of the plant. So build more large reactors, build 4 small reactors at the Darlington station, rebuild Pickering, rebuild Darlington, with modest investments in renewables and efficiency. But I want to draw your attention to the bottom line subsidies. $7.3 billion per year is what you and I are paying to, what our taxes are paying to artificially lower our electricity rates. If we knew how much Doug Ford was spending, how high cost their nuclear and gas program is, our electricity rates would go through the roof if they weren't being subsidized, and people would be really pissed about it, especially if they knew that renewables were a fraction of the cost. So they artificially lower the rate so that nobody knows, nobody's asking, and then they can continue with their propaganda of, nuclear is the lowest cost, safest, cleanest form of electricity. That's their line. So, and nuclear and gas go side by side. At least in Ontario, that's the case. They need gas as backup. And to rebuild this aging nuclear infrastructure, they are building out more gas plants and ramping up the output of our existing gas plants, which were initially built as peaker plants. They were only supposed to be going for 10, 15% of the time. But in Toronto, the Portland's plant is going over 90%. It's running over 90% of the time. So these are the dirtiest, and they're fossil fuel generating plants. And you can see from 2017 to 2030 how much they're actually ramping up. The percentage of our grid that's coming from fossil fuels is ramping up in the middle of a climate crisis, when the whole world is essentially on standby to reduce climate emissions and to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. Doug Ford is ramping up fossil fuels in line with his nuclear plans. So every nuclear reactor produces plutonium. It's just part of the waste product. And plutonium fuels nuclear weapons. It's not the only thing that fuels nuclear weapons, but it is the major component of nuclear weapons. It's in the waste product. Plutonium is human-made. It does not exist anywhere in a natural form. It only exists as part of the nuclear fuel cycle. It's produced in the waste. And there is as much plutonium at the Pickering nuclear site. And for those of you who aren't from Toronto, Pickering is only 30 kilometers from the CN Tower, downtown Toronto. 30 kilometers as the crow flies. There's as much plutonium at all the waste at the Pickering nuclear site, which is Canada's oldest commercial nuclear power site, and it has 8 reactors. It's huge. It's one of the oldest and largest nuclear stations in the world. And there's as much plutonium in the waste at Pickering as all the nuclear weapons in the world. 12,000 nuclear weapons. Now you'd have to reprocess and pull the plutonium out of the waste, but it's exactly what the nuclear industry is proposing to do in Canada. They want to reprocess, separate the plutonium from the waste, and they claim that it is to fuel more reactors. And they're doing research on this at Chalk River, and they have applied for it and gotten federal funding to develop a site, a plutonium reprocessing site in New Brunswick. And then they will also build a reactor that can use the plutonium as a fuel. Now, this process of reprocessing plutonium from nuclear waste was banned in Canada and in the United States since the 70s because it's so dirty and so dangerous. We don't want to create a plutonium economy. When you pull, it's very difficult for a nefarious entity to pull the plutonium out of the waste at Pickering. But if you actually get an industry that is approved to pull the plutonium out, then a nefarious actor can steal that, or some of it can be siphoned off and produce nuclear weapons. And so that for that reason, it's been banned for the last 50 years in United States and Canada. And now Canada is opening up that process with no public consultation and no parliamentary discussion about it. So let's look at some of the eco-catastrophes around the world and what their consequences are. Chernobyl, you will all remember, 1986, northern Ukraine. That was estimated to cost the Russian economy, the USSR economy, $700 billion. 500,000 liquidators were used to go in and shovel the molten waste from the explosion. They were only allowed to be there for 40 to 90 seconds. And then they had to leave right away because they were getting such heavy doses of radioactivity. And the radioactive contamination spread all around the world, not just USSR and Belarus and Europe, but it also spread it around Europe. And for decades, and even to today, like boars are considered radioactive. You're not supposed to eat wild boars because they are rummaging around the soils and pulling up mushrooms, and which are still radioactive. And, you know, uh, tens of thousands of wild animals and wild elk and reindeer and cattle were killed after that because they were drinking milk that was radioactive, and they were eating food that was radioactive. So, I mean, and that was the initial evacuation zone of Chernobyl was 30 kilometers. Now just think, Pickering is 30 kilometers from Toronto. There's 2.2 million people that live within 30 kilometers of the Pickering nuclear station. But Chernobyl was a rural site. So only, I don't know how many people were evacuated, a couple of 100,000. But I'm not sure exactly. But it was a rural site. And so there's a huge dead zone or no-go zone, 2,600 square kilometers today around Chernobyl, where nobody's allowed to live. Like, I mean, that is an eco-catastrophe beyond. And there was a fellow named Alexei Yablokov, a Russian scientist, who, after Chernobyl in the decades following, he did an analysis of over 1,000 published titles, mostly in the Soviet Union and in Belarus. And so they were in Slavic languages. And plus, he scoured internet and printed publications, and he produced a book that was published by the New York Academy of Scientists, and his conclusion was that basically 1 million premature deaths happened as a result of the radioactivity that was released from Chernobyl. Of course, it's a very different story you hear from the International Atomic Energy Agency and, Western countries that, still want to be using nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And they claim that there were maybe only a couple of thousand deaths, but, it's a huge spread of potential contamination and impact. Then Fukushima in 2011, north of Japan, triple meltdown. Again, so this accident, they're talking, and the evacuation zone for there was about 50 kilometers. So imagine 50 kilometers around Pickering. That would go all the way, to Mississauga. So we're talking several million people. Again, this was mostly a rural area. There was a small town around it, but most of the radioactivity from this triple meltdown went over and was deposited in the ocean. And where it was deposited on land, they had to scrape up all that soil and forests, and it's still in bags, like millions of bags that are distributed all around the country right now. They don't know how to get rid of it. It's still, they're releasing radioactive tritiated water that's cooling the reactor core, which they still haven't gotten to or been able to bury it or neutralize it in any way. They claim it was $500 million, but it's just the prices are still going up. Like this quite catastrophic. There's a doctor from University of South Carolina named Timothy Musso, and he has a whole team of researchers. He has been researching the consequences of both Chernobyl and Fukushima radio accidents or radioactivity on plants and animals. And he spoke at the U of T a few years ago. I saw him speak there and recorded it. And there's a recording of him on the Ontario Clean Air Alliance YouTube page. But his research is ongoing, and it shows increased mutations and genetic damage, poor performing and malformed sperm, sterility, pollen inviability, cancers, cataracts, mental retardation, fewer species, fewer numbers, dead zones, and no evidence of adaptation. So very catastrophic. And now we're looking at Zaporizhia in southern Ukraine, 6 reactors. It's the largest nuclear station in Europe. 2 weeks after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russian forces seized the plant where they still are today. It is a weaponized station. They did shut down the reactors, but it still requires an electrical source to cool the waste. If you don't cool the waste, like what happened at Fukushima, the earthquake knocked out the electrical, the ability for an electrical grid to cool the waste. And it was the waste that essentially exploded because there was no electricity to cool the waste. And now we're dealing with that at Zaporizhia. Because, you know, that they dammed, or they blew up the dam, which the cooling source, was the river for the cooling source for the Zaporizhia plant. So it's so vulnerable. All nuclear stations can be weapons of war in times of war. So Canada now wants to get into the small nuclear reactor, market. And the goal of the nuclear industry, it's completely centralizing in Canada, and primarily in Chalk River, which is, Canada's ground zero for the nuclear weapons program. Like, Canada started with United States and Britain back in the 40s. We had uranium in Ontario, and we were prepared to do the research up at Chalk River, which is just upstream from Ottawa. And we still have that research center, and it has essentially lost its reason for being. And in fact, Harper kind of shut down the program because it was too expensive and we were spending billions of dollars. And he essentially gave the research to SNC-Lavalin for a penny. There was the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. There were 4,000 employees at the time. And he just gutted it and gave it to, now we're down to 40. I think AECL only has 40 employees. Anyways, they're looking for a reason for being. And now small modular reactors, they're going to have research going on up there. And then they need, satellite research places, like, for example, what they want to do in New Brunswick, where they want to reprocess plutonium out of the nuclear waste. So the industry in 2018 came up with a roadmap for Canada, and they want to put hundreds of SMRs. Their vision is hundreds of SMRs all over Canada, and create an industry that can be more modular, that they can actually send overseas, they can sell to Europe, they can just populate the planet with this new industry. But of course, all nuclear reactors produce plutonium. So, and most of these countries that want to buy these reactors from Canada, when we eventually have a program, they don't already have nuclear power programs. So, like, it's a real danger zone. Meanwhile, so there's huge opposition in Canada to this massive, and it's funded by government. The feds are on board. The provinces are on board. There's like 5 provinces that have already signed memorandums of understanding saying which reactors they want, and Ontario's first out of the gate. And they've already contracted with GE Hitachi, American Japanese company, to build 4 reactors at the Darlington station. Now, they're selling this as a climate solution, but we know that it takes 10 to 15 years to build, and none of these have even been built. There are no SMRs of any of the research types that they're planning on building. There's one in Russia and one in China. And neither of them are grid connected. They're just experimental. They're super expensive. So this is a
2
new
minutes
industry.
remaining.
Pardon?
2 minutes remaining.
Oh my gosh. I'm out of control. So super expensive. And we still don't have a solution what to do with the waste in Canada. And no country has figured out what to do with the nuclear waste. In fact, no country in the world is actually storing high-level nuclear waste in any long-term permanent solution. Several countries want to build DGRs or deep geological repositories, including Canada. None have been licensed to date. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is going renewable. The International Energy Agency says 80% of new power over the next 5 years will come from renewable power, which is a good thing. And this is the what we are celebrating really tonight. Renewables are on the rise. Nuclear has suffered net loss. Renewables are growing. And by 2028, the whole world will be powered. 42% of the world will be powered by renewables by 2028. And this is an example, solar power. Look at from 2001 to 2023. And I just want to address the 440 megawatts in 2023. That's triple Canada's grid. So all of Canada is 150 gigawatts. And it took us 100 years to build out our grid, wind, water, solar, coal, gas, etc. 150 gigawatts. And in 1 year, the solar industry installed triple Canada's grid. So it is really growing exponentially. We have, and this is the price chart. The one at the far right is SMRs or nuclear. The second one on the far right, peaker plants, gas plants. So Doug Ford is picking the two most expensive. Wind, water, solar are all in the middle. Conservation at the far left. Even efficiency is our best option. Quebec water power and storage, they're a fraction of the cost. Great Lakes wind power, we're advocating for lifting the moratorium on offshore wind. We could power all of Ontario with wind power in the Great Lakes alone. New technologies, smart technologies like electric vehicles, bidirectional batteries can help store intermittent wind and solar. The internet, yeah, like we don't have time to waste on experimental technologies like new nuclear with all the potential problems of weapons proliferation, accidents, catastrophes, high cost. We need to move quickly and reduce our climate emissions by 2030, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And wind and solar can be rolled out in a year. The COP, the Conference of the Parties that happened in Dubai last year, the whole world committed to tripling renewable power and doubling efficiency. And so we are advocating in Canada that we triple wind and solar by 2035, or the IPCC said 2030, and double efficiency. So no new funding on nukes and gas, only on renewables and energy efficiency. There's been all sorts of research that shows how Canada could go 100% renewable. This one's from Stanford U. This one's David Suzuki Foundation. This is our analysis of Ontario.
Please wrap up.
So we say no to gas and nuclear, yes to renewables. And if you go to cleanairalliance.org /triple, you can send an email to the Premier, and then I'll get your email on the back end and I'll add you to our database. You can keep up to speed on these issues. Ta-da! I finished, sort of. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. Thanks for listening.
Thanks. That's okay, Angela. Very good. Our next speaker is Stephen Crozier. He is the president of the Surrey White Rock, British Columbia NDP Electoral District Association, EDA, and regional representative for Surrey Delta on the BC NDP Standing Committee on the Environment and economy. He is also president-elect and secretary of the Rotary Club of Nature Celebrators, Canada's only environmental Rotary club. Stephen was the federal NDP candidate in South Surrey. White Rock in the 2019 election, but was not allowed to run in 2021, despite being asked and supported by the local EDA executive. He was also a candidate in the last municipal election in 2022. Stephen was a teacher for over 30 years, mostly at Douglas College in BC, where he held several positions with the Douglas College Facility Association, DCFA, including vice president negotiations. This led to representing the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators, FPSE, on the executive board of the New Westminster and District Labour Council, eventually becoming president of the council until he retired in 2021. Stephen is a member of Socialist Action and the NDP Socialist Caucus. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. Geez, when I hear the introduction, I think maybe I should have done a better job on my speech. But anyway, I'll do my best. First, I want to thank the SA for this opportunity to speak on this really important topic, and thank you for Angela, sorry, and very much presenting what it is that we're up against and some of the advancements that we have made. One of my, what would I say, reservations is about how Labor has not actually got on board with this, and I just started wondering, why is this the case? So of course, we don't have much, it's not a very unclear choice. We don't want to have eco-catastrophe, and so it seems to me that we must choose eco-socialism. And a more interesting question that I started thinking of is whether the values and related actions of eco-socialism conflict with historical traditional socialism and the workers' movement and the establishment of a workers' state. What I thought is, like, capitalism is so obviously the root of our multiple crises, like that's climate, affordability, including housing, poverty, education, healthcare, war. Name a problem, and you can pretty well say capitalism is the cause. And why is that? Well, capitalism is about exploitation, be it people or the planet. And it's all done for private profits, most certainly not for the public good. So capitalism doesn't care if it kills the planet and its species, as long as there is profit in it, more profit than protecting the planet and its species. And at this point, there is. I mean, in the short term, there is more profit to be made from destroying the planet than protecting it. There's less wealth, but there is more profit, which is more concentration of capital in fewer and fewer hands as the wealth is stripped from the planet and most of its people. There's no doubt about it in my mind that capitalism must die or we will. And of course, I don't expect a lot of disagreement here among us on this issue. However, a question of whether, while eco-socialism is the solution, socialism per se has been standing in the way, I think is an interesting question to pursue. It is worth observing that capitalism, socialism, and the environmental crisis all grew together out of the seed of the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith, a moral philosopher, wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Coincidentally, the same year that the United States became a nation. Karl Marx wrote Volume 1 of Das Kapital in 1867, and that was the year Canada became a nation, and followed that by Volume 2 in 1885 and Volume 3 in 1894. Less known as these things were going on is the fact that Joseph Fourier, a French mathematician and physicist, proposed the greenhouse effect in 18 1927. And further to this, in 1856, American scientist, inventor, and women's rights campaigner Eunice Newton Foote demonstrated that rising CO2 levels could affect climate by increasing atmospheric temperatures. And I didn't know that until about a year ago, whenever I was doing some research. So interesting that it was all coming, beginning at that point. So in fact, capitalism, socialism, and the climate crisis are inexorably linked. Capitalism is so obviously the problem that railing against it would be not really worth our time, I don't think. The question is whether socialism, the rising power of the working class, the workers' state, is the solution. Is there any evidence to suggest this? So I took a look at some of the things that Marx had said about the environment. And I can't say that I know extensively about this, but the first quote that I got here is very much like what a lot of Indigenous leaders are saying these days. Even, and I quote, even an entire society, a nation, or all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the earth. They are simply its possessors, its beneficiaries, and have to bequeath it in an improved state to succeeding generations. And don't you wish that we had followed that advice? Unfortunately, I think that we can see that generation after generation, the earth has been compromised. And further to this, this is a little bit of an indication of how socialism can be helpful in this particular respect of helping the planet. Association applied to land reestablishes now on a rational basis, no longer mediated by serfdom, overlordship, and the silly mysticism of private property. It reestablishes the intimate ties of man with the earth, since the earth ceases to be an object of huckstering. So this, to me, was a pretty positive quote. And Marx also warned about the dangers of soil degradation, diverting rivers into canals, polluting them with industrial and human waste. However, unfortunately, there's also this quote, which I wrote out. As for the farmer, the industrial capitalist, and the agricultural worker, they are no more bound to the land they exploit than are the employer and the worker in the factories to the cotton and the wool they manufacture. They feel an attachment only for the price of their production, the monetary product. And this suggests the view that the land exists to be exploited for monetary gain, not the view that it is to be respected and protected. And the following, I found this a rather interesting quote, kind of a glaring misunderstanding of the consequences of burning fuel. The combustion of a pound of coal or wood restores to the air not merely the elements needed to reproduce this pound of wood, or, under certain conditions, coal, but the process of combustion in itself transforms a certain quantity of nitrogen in the air into a nutrient indispensable for the production of bread and meat. So this one seems a little bit to me like those who argue that CO2 being released into the air is a good thing because it's going to green the planet, because CO2 is needed by vegetation. And even more unfortunate, I found this on Leon Trotsky and his view of humankind's relationship with the environment. Quote, man will occupy himself with re-registering mountains and rivers, and will earnestly and repeatedly make improvements in nature. In the end, he will have rebuilt the earth, if not in his own image, at least according to his own taste. We have not the slightest fear that this taste will be bad. And it seems to me that this is really the path that we've taken, that Trotsky has paved the way for, and it has certainly left a bad taste. So this would seem to suggest that the most significant difference between capitalism and socialism is not about the exploitation of the Earth's resources, but about who gets the value of that exploitation. This similarity between capitalism and socialism in terms of the relationship between humans and the Earth's resources has resulted in the continued deterioration of the environment. To illustrate this, I want to share some of the information on the labor movement, if it can be called that, and Canada's fossil fuel industry, so TMX, LNG, and the tar sands. So even after Kinder Morgan told union leaders, this is sort of like in support of environmental destruction, if you will, for very little coming back to workers and the working class. So even after Kinder Morgan told union leaders that their workers would not be working on TMX, the building trades continued to support the project. Lionel Railton from the International Union of Operating Engineers stated this, which is kind of like, why are we doing this? Because it employs a lot of our men and women. But this was at a point where they were not going to be employed as union employees at all, but it was creating jobs, creating work. And of course, it's well known that after Kinder Morgan sold TMX to the government of Canada in May of 2018, Kinder Morgan executives paid themselves $1 million plus bonuses. Still, and after that sort of fiasco, if you will, what Mark Olson, president of Laborers International Union of North America, LIUNA, said in 2019, so this is a year after, he said this of TMX and the tar sands, and I find this just unbelievable. Here's the quote: "It may sound like I'm pushing the corporate line, but it is the most environmentally conscious project in the world. I've seen how they pull back the forests in the Alberta oil sands, mine the sand in an open pit, extract the bitumen from the sand, and then put the sand and boreal forest back in place. You would never know the area had been mined. It's ethically and environmentally produced. Why would we use oil from other countries like Venezuela? We want to export to China." So, I mean, this could have come out of the mouth of a capitalist invested in the oil sands. And it's rather shocking that it's coming from a labor leader. So in the end, unions managed to get 50% of the jobs on TMX. And in the tar sands, salaries average around $100,000 a year. The top pay is about $130,000 a year, but many of the salaries are as low as $65,000 a year. And with LNG, a consortium led by Shell, which also includes Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Korea Gas, the only social performance measure in the memorandum of understanding that they signed between LNG and the building trades is that LNG hire locally. There were no environmental measures. All of these points underscore that in capturing the value of exploiting the Earth's resources to the point of collapse, the working class is losing. Still, we have a Labour government in BC which continues to support LNG Canada. And like Labour leaders, many of whom hold power in the BC NDP as well, they will tell you it's all about jobs. But the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has made it clear over a year ago, in fact, that there could be no more fossil fuel expansion if we are to survive as a species. And furthermore, BC Premier David Eby said—
5 minutes remaining.
I'm sorry, 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So, on October 22nd, 2022, and I quote, "We cannot continue to expand fossil fuel infrastructure and hit our climate goals." Yet a few weeks ago, the government here in BC approved the expansion of Tilbury and the construction of Cedar, two LNG facilities. And this sounds very much like the Liberal government declaring a climate emergency and then the very next day buying a pipeline. And of course, we're told it's all about jobs. So historically, the working class has fought for more jobs, more power, more money, more stuff. To these ends, we have not distinguished ourselves much from the values of the capitalist class, except they make their money in their sleep and we make ours working and making everything. This idea of more and more on an infinite planet has logically resulted in less and less of the planet. So this has to change. Historically, the power of the working class has come from the work we do, but eco-socialism would suggest, somewhat paradoxically, that we must use the power to move our power, that power, to move towards less and less work, not more. That we must move away from consumerism towards less and less stuff, not more. And this would require less and less money. If we do not do this, in terms of saving the planet and its species, we are no better than the capitalists. It's time to shed the more mentality, historically shared by socialists and capitalists alike. That is what eco-socialism brings to the table, uniting two of the children of the Industrial Revolution, socialism and an understanding of climate collapse. We must ask ourselves, more what? The answer to that question will distinguish the working class from the capitalist class. Meanwhile, environmentalists must put down their placards and pick up their tools, and workers of the world must unite in solidarity to build the new economy. Only we can do it, and that is the work that must be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Our next speaker is Dr. Tom Baker. He is a retired veterinarian epidemiologist with over 25 years experience in the public sector in food safety, animal health, and emergency management. He is a member of Socialist Action, the NDP Socialist Caucus, and president of the Hamilton Centre, Ontario NDP Riding Association. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. I want to talk, we're all coming at this issue, rather broad issue from different angles. I'm going to be talking more on the farming, the food side of this. So basically eco-socialism and food insecurity. I want to look at the relationship between food security, protection of the environment, and food sovereignty. Are these competing concepts? Also want to look at what modern agriculture contributes to climate change and food insecurity. And if time allows, I want to talk a little bit about a couple other issues that Ian Angus, a prominent eco-socialist writer, has looked at. One is the decline of biodiversity, species extinctions, and also the issue of cheap food. So first of all, on food security and food sovereignty, these two concepts are sometimes seen as incompatible. I just want to explore this a bit so we have terminology straight. Food security was first articulated in the mid-1970s. It was a time of turmoil in grain markets. There was rising hunger, and it was the height of the Cold War. In 1974, the World Food Conference defined food security as the availability at all times of adequate world food supplies of basic foodstuffs to sustain a steady expansion of food consumption and offset fluctuations in production and prices. Food security, the term, is now applied at all levels, from the individual person to the local community, regional levels, and of course at the national and global levels. Food security now centers the concept of access to appropriate, that is cultural, safe, and nutritious, access to appropriate and sufficient food. So it's one thing to have the food, but do people have access to it? The other term, food sovereignty, which seeks to encourage political mobilization around peasant rights, was first popularized by the peasant movement La Via Campesina in the early 90s. It was determined to be a precondition to genuine food security. So critics have argued that the food sovereignty agenda does not ensure equitable access to food, particularly for non-producers, people who aren't farmers, or necessarily adequate nutrition. The policy wonks that specialize in looking at hunger, they seem to typically prioritize food production over access. Because, of course, production is what makes profits for capitalism. So they would often typically support a neoliberal trade and market orientation that is directly opposed to the food sovereignty approach, which favors localized food systems and greater self-sufficiency. In the global south, small farmers and the landless have organized and demand access to land, the right to a decent livelihood under the banner of food sovereignty, sustainable agriculture, and biodiversity conservation. In 1996, La Via Campesina, which is now part of a broader umbrella organization, called for food sovereignty as well. The conjoining of the rights of people to consume food to the rights of people to produce their own food. And they released a document 2021 called the Food Sovereignty, a Manifesto for the Future of Our Planet. Just a couple excerpts that you might find interesting. They said even the FAO has come to recognize the centrality of people's food sovereignty in international policymaking. They referred to peasant agroecology as fundamental to food sovereignty and the fight against global warming. Sustained campaigns by social movements have also resulted in several legal victories against corporations producing agrotoxins, other chemical inputs, and transgenic seeds. In their document, it goes on to say the capitalist world order views food sovereignty as impinging on their financial interests. They prefer a world of monoculture and homogeneous tastes. Food that is mass-produced using cheap labor in faraway factories, disregarding ecological, human, and social impacts. They prefer economies of scale to local economies, a global free market with speculation and cutthroat competition over solidarity economies that require more robust territorial markets, that is, local peasant markets, and the active participation of local producers. There was a quote I particularly noticed from this document. The capitalist trawlers crawl the oceans and rivers, netting fishes for a global market while coastal communities starve. They hijack indigenous peasant seeds through patents and seed treaties. In summary, they said all food and agriculture policy must be based on food sovereignty principles. Ian Angus, who I mentioned, says without an agroecological revolution, the sixth extinction cannot be stopped. And without the active involvement of mass peasant movements, the agrarian transformation cannot succeed. I want to talk now about so-called modern agriculture in the global north, particularly, and what it does in impact on climate change and food insecurity. In the past century, agriculture took a big turn from its, the millennia of time when agriculture was practiced. And basically, you have a new type of agriculture in the last century that is massively dependent on fossil fuel sources, and that emits billions of tons of climate destabilizing greenhouse gases. We've seen a dramatic escalation of energy inputs in modern farming. The machinery, everything's mechanized, fuels, pumping of irrigation water, iron and steel, high-tech seeds, complex global technology, information technology, exotic petrochemicals, energy-intensive fertilizer. That's what modern agriculture, that's how it's done. Now, these emissions and the resulting climate destabilization are now disrupting our food production efforts themselves. These disruptions from climate change will increase in frequency and severity as the temperatures rise. Storms intensify, floods and droughts occur more often, resulting in shifts or collapse of entire ecosystems. Our capacity to actually produce food is being challenged and reduced. We've driven our food system into a civilizational cul-de-sac. More technology, more energy inputs in an attempt to produce more food is backfiring. We need a new direction and a structural transformation. Farm leaders from North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean had a meeting in Quebec City a few years back where they denounced the free trade and globalization experiment as a failure for farm families, peasants, and agricultural workers. The Canadian National Farmers Union criticized the current produce more, export more model of agriculture and proposed organic agriculture, supply management, reduced input agriculture. These alternatives embody principles that stand in direct opposition to the production and trade maximizing principles of the WTO, NAFTA, and other trade agreements that work to extract wealth from the actual wealth producers, the farmers, and to transfer it to a shrinking number of wealthy investors who own the dominant corporations in each sector. Rural communities, drained of wealth and capital as farmers and small processors are forced out, these communities are left dependent on the tender mercies of outside corporate investors, such as Cargill, Smithfield, Maple Leaf. This facilitates and accelerates the extraction of wealth and capital, thus exacerbating the problem. The National Farmers Union has stated that an agricultural structure that's increasingly corporate and non-family owned tends to lead to rural population decline, lower incomes, fewer community services, less participation in democratic processes, less retail trade, environmental pollution, more unemployment, and an emerging rigid class structure in the rural countryside. The National Farmers Union called for a new vision for the world agriculture trade and production system, one that promoted stability, health, biodiversity, and culture, one that respects and builds the health and well-being of all people, the earth, the air, and of our animals, and now and for future generations. I want to explore a little bit the issue of biodiversity and species extinction. Ian Angus's book, Redder Shade of Green, the chapter on global South farming and biodiversity, takes up an interesting discussion. He says, contrary to some, life is not a zero-sum game. He says there's a false paradigm that you have to choose one of people and farming or wildlife and diversity. So he challenges that, and he takes on this. I think there's a group called Nature Conservancy of Canada and similar organizations around the world, who basically purchase land to make into wilderness preserves, with the lauded goal of preventing species extinctions. Ian says that this is an unproductive and harmful strategy. He says preserving biodiversity is inseparable from the growing struggle of peasant farmers for human rights, land, and sustainable agriculture. He argues the issue is not how many people there are, but what the people do. Some forms of agriculture destroy life. Others preserve and expand it. He says the biodiversity friendly farming can actually slow or reverse what is called the sixth extinction. So he's able to provide data that showed that this species biodiversity was actually decreased in these wilderness preserves. These preserves ban human activity, And that he says this was a doomed strategy that increases the likelihood of extinctions. And some of this is a little beyond my knowledge, but he counterposed to this model a matrix of fragments of forest separated by sustainable farms. So rather than having a huge wilderness with no humans and no agriculture, he looks at having a matrix with fragments of forest separated by sustainable farms, which actually is what farming looked like a couple hundred years ago. Without the migration, he said in these wilderness preserves, without any migration of species, local populations will disappear over time. Large monoculture, pesticide-drenched farms, of course, reduce the opportunity for migratory potential that is needed if the meta population is to be conserved in the long run. So many conservationists think of agriculture as the cause of biodiversity loss. He says this is incorrect. It's the type of agriculture that determines that. Excuse me. Combination of traditional knowledge and the latest agroecological research can produce results that are biodiversity friendly while producing as much food as the high input industrial farms. If time permits, I want to look at finally at the issue of cheap food, which is a big deal right now. According Jagmeet Singh has been, and others have been tapping into this concern.
5 minutes remaining.
Okay, perfect. High grocery bills, basically. In a world where over 800 million people experience absolute hunger every day, and 2 billion people suffer from food insecurity. Hunger can have many causes: poor harvest, climate change, disease, or failures of government. This focus on grocery prices recently, the demand for cheap food. Many would argue that cheap food is the great safeguard that stands between poor people and hunger. To others, cheap food is seen as an evil that results in underpaid farmers, degraded land, severely stressed livestock, and irreversible damage to the environment. It's clear that there are enormous external costs associated with cheap food. The real question is not if food is cheap, but if it is affordable, whether for those who eat it, or those who produce it, or those who serve or sell it. Affordable should not only apply to consumption. In reality, there is no shortage of food in the world today. Despite that, the most commonly proposed solution to world hunger is new technology to increase food production. I'm not going to have time to get into the whole issue of how much food we waste that we produce. While scientific research is vitally important, in truth, the food crisis is not a technical problem. It's a social and political problem. The global food industry is not organized to feed the hungry. It's organized to maximize profits for corporate agribusiness. Today's farm and food crisis confirms what Marx said in Volume 3 of Capital regarding technical improvements. Quote, "The capitalist system works against a rational agriculture. A rational agriculture is incompatible with a capitalist system. A system that puts profit ahead of human needs has driven millions of producers off the land, undermined the earth's productivity while poisoning its air and water, and condemning nearly 1 billion people to chronic hunger and malnutrition. The food crisis and farm crisis are rooted in an irrational, anti-human system. To feed the world, urban and rural working people must join together to sweep that system away." I didn't get a chance to really explore what kind of demands we should be looking at with this situation. I'll throw out a few that some of them from Ian and some from other sources. Stop the war on farmers in the global south. Stop using food for fuel. Didn't get a chance to explore that, but most of the corn we grow goes into fuel rather than food. Cancel third world debts. Get the WTO out of agriculture. Self-determination for the global south. Government support for sustainable agriculture. Nationalize the major food retailers and critical input providers. By the way, that was a demand that came out of Socialist Caucus here. So I'm going to leave it at that. Maybe I'll just wrap up. I got a minute Bill 185 was passed this week at Queen's Park. I don't know if people have been following that. This is a bill that basically Doug Ford is ramming through legislation that will allow for massive urban boundary expansions. Land speculators will be able to bypass municipal opposition. Needless to say, paving over farmland and endangered habitats will result in less local food production and a further loss of scarce farmland, driving up prices for working farmers. This undermines food security and contributes to numerous drivers of climate change. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, so now we're going to go into the Q&A, and I will go to Flo for the questions in the chat, and I will try my best to see the ones online. And we're going to take 3 questions and give the panelists 6 minutes to answer the 1, 2, 3 questions, however many they want. And Tom will be the first, Angela second, and Stephen third. Okay, so I'm going to, I see one Ann on the floor, so I'm going to go there first and then go to Flo for 2 questions from the chat. So the first question will be asked by John O. And then could you read 2 questions from the chat, Flo?
Sorry, John, gotta.
Okay,
Yeah, there we
okay,
go.
greetings to everybody. And
Just a second, John. We're going to put your, sorry, John, but we're going to put 3 questions forward. So I will come to you once Flo reads out the 2 questions from the chat. Then you will
Oh,
speak,
okay.
okay?
Sorry, I misunderstood. I thought John was going first. Okay, so
Okay.
I'll read these 2 questions. First one from Julius. What do you think of the recent Oliver Stone film, Nuclear Now, which argues that nuclear energy is necessary to effectively fight climate change and that renewable energy sources are simply unable to keep up with the dire needs to reduce carbon emissions, all the while it has received massive investments over many years around the world? Second question from Kiri. Why do our mainstream political parties do not prioritize building public transit systems instead of promoting traffic gridlock through electric cars?
Thank you, Flo. Okay, John. John O., you have 3 minutes to ask your question.
okay, I need to be unmuted.
You are.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Hello, everybody, and especially to Angela, Steve, and Tom. Though, just absolutely excellent presentations. I've like tiny questions to each of you. Angela, what is happening with the burying of nuclear waste under Lake Huron? What's the status of that proposal now? For Steve, you talk about a less economy. Will overpopulation and a movement towards depopulating the Earth, population control, is that part of the solution, do you think? And finally, for Tom, can you comment on the European struggles of the farmers there? Their production is trying to be cut back by their governments, and the use of fertilizer is trying to be cut back by their governments. Could you comment on that? Thanks a lot. Excellent presentations.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, so we're going to go to the panel. You have 6 minutes each. Tom, Angela, and Stephen. Tom?
Well, I didn't see the Oliver Stone film, so I won't comment on that. Kerry raised an interesting question on the public transit being given a relatively low priority by most governments in comparison, and on the other hand, a huge enthusiasm for electric vehicles. I think the short answer is there's more money in electric vehicles than there is in public transit. This is being seen as a huge growth opportunity for capitalists, and I don't know how many plants now in Ontario are being funded. I've lost track, but I do know that China is producing a much better electric vehicle and at a fraction of the price So I think this is all about capitalist competition and potential, just like when computers came along, a potential for new growth opportunity. Unfortunately, I'm not sure, what the net benefit will be. I guess I have concerns about, the components that go into producing electric cars and how do you dispose of that. I'm skeptical. Just leave it at that. And John's question about the European farm workers, I'm not real close to this, but my understanding is the EU sets the standards for farming, and included in that is how much fertilizer and chemical inputs they can use. I understand there's an attempt to have less fertilizer and less chemical inputs, and that this is impacting on the farmer's ability to produce sufficient quantity of crops to make a living. That's my understanding. There could be more than that. So yeah, there's been some massive farm demonstrations, and I'm you have to be, sort of two sides to this. Farmers deserve to be able to make a living off the food they produce. The public in the planet needs to also be treated properly.
Okay, Angela?
Thanks. Good questions. Okay, Oliver Stone. So I think he's probably a fantastic filmmaker, and he has a long history of doing so. But I don't think he's credible on the nuclear/energy issue, just as I don't think he's credible on the film he did about Ukraine. So he's a controversial figure, and I think he's on the wrong side of history on the nuclear issue. Okay, so that being said, it is controversial that there are some climate campaigners. For example, James Hansen is the most famous. He's, he worked with NASA, and he began the whole conversation about climate change. He's a scientist, a climate scientist, and he also is on the same side of that fence as Oliver Stone in saying renewables can't meet the needs of our growing population and our growing need for energy, and renewables just can't do it, and we need nuclear power. So even but there again, I just think they're on the wrong side. With time, we are going to roll out a renewables future. For example, there are a dozen countries already 99% renewably powered. And there are 60 more that are aiming for 100% renewable future within a decade or something. So the world is aspiring to that. And I think Oliver Stone and James Hansen and other pro-nuclear advocates are not looking at the entire equation of the downsides of a nuclear future. That said, I think there are challenges there's going to be challenges in how to get all it's not going to be easy to go 100% renewable, and all the precious metals that are going to be required in mining. But when you compare the amount, I think it's 1/1000th. I think Mark Jacobson says the amount of mining and minerals required for a renewable future compared to a fossil fueled future, which is what we have today, is 1/1000th. So I believe, as a species, will solve the problems of recycling and mining and such with the renewables future. As for EVs, of course, we need to redesign our cities and, for pedestrianization and bicycles and transit. But if we're going to have vehicles moving throughout the city, whether they're police cars or ambulances or buses or private vehicles, they've got to be electrified. And so I'm not saying they deserve all the subsidies, anything like that. And it goes hand in hand with redesigning our cities and changing the priority to be more about mass transit and bicycles and pedestrianization. But all vehicles are going to be electrified in a decade or two. Like that's just like electricity is going to be renewable. That's the future. And I think that's way better. Like as a cyclist, when I'm going behind an EV or a tram, an electric vehicle tram, or an internal combustion vehicle, I don't want to be behind that stinky, belching, climate polluting internal combustion engine. So we need to go electric. And as for nuke waste, John, so Canada is looking for a solution. It's a PR solution. They don't know what to do with the nuclear waste. They've been telling us since they started in the 40s, producing nuclear waste. They've been saying, we're going to deal with the waste, deal with it. And they've had all of these, you know, national forums and conversations. And right now, the best that the industry can come up with is buried in a hole. And they started with 20 some communities that were part of the conversation. They're down to 2. One northwest of Thunder Bay, Ignace area, and one south of Kincardine in the South Bruce area. You know, the industry definitely wants to bury it in South Bruce because that's where most of the nuclear waste is in Southern Ontario. They don't want to have to truck it up all the way to Northwestern Ontario. But so far, these 2 communities are in the process. And the one which would be in South Bruce, you're right, it's basically under Lake Huron. And, you know, they know that these sites are, you know, that the nuclear waste is going to expand and heat up and leak. And so they have all these, you know, burial layers to contain it. In fact, there have been 3 nuclear waste DGRs or deep geologic repositories where nuclear waste has been buried, not high-level fuel waste. No high-level fuel waste in the world has been buried in a DGR. But there have been 3 or maybe a few more that are burying nuclear waste, like low and intermediate level, and all 3 have failed. And one of them, they're actually in, say, Germany, they're pulling the waste out. So, you know, like a DGR is just a PR solution for the industry for a while. The environmental community is advocating for the waste to stay on site where it's produced as an interim measure, stored in above ground attack-resistant reinforced concrete vaults, much safer, monitorable, and retrievable when the inevitable happens that they start leaking because they're so hot. And they have to, these wastes, according to the industry, has to be isolated from the environment for a million years. So, you know, it's an intractable problem. They don't know how to deal with it. And as long as they are producing it, they have to pretend to be doing something with it. So at this point, the latest, you know, they were talking about shooting it out to the moon or shooting out to space. Like there's all these different solutions. Right now, their favorite solution is a DGR. But who knows if that'll ever get built. And the 2 options, we think that the First Nations in both communities are going to say no. And they have a veto power. And if they both say no, then the industry is back to the drawing board to find another willing host. And it'll be decades and decades. Even as it is, it's going to be decades for them to ship. At this point, they're saying, even if best case scenario, they don't, did someone stop me?
Please wrap up.
Okay, that's it. That's all I need to say. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, folks. Stephen?
Sure. Okay, so yeah, I'll start off and I'll second Angela's comment about Oliver Stone. I mean, I think there's value in the movies. I haven't seen that particular movie, but I think there's value in the movies he does in that he is controversial and he makes us think about certain things. But I don't think it's like something to necessarily follow. It definitely brings up some points for us to consider. What came to mind was a movie I saw called Pandora's Promise. I don't know if anyone's seen that. I think it might even be available on YouTube. And this is about the small, modular nuclear reactors, and how it is that they're supposed to save the world. But again, it's just as Angela showed in her graphs. I mean, they're just too damn expensive, and we wouldn't have time even if it did work, right? And we could get rid of somehow deal with the nuclear waste afterwards. I do think this also points out we think we're going to be able to continue with the same kind of lifestyle we have now. One of the things I was hoping would happen during the pandemic is that we would reevaluate our values, recognize what it is that we want in our world and with our relationships with each other. And it ain't a new pair of shoes, We can live without a lot of the consumerism, which means that we could cut back on a lot of the power that's being used right now to build a bunch of crap for us to, what's the saying, that we work to make money, to buy things we don't, we work at a job we don't like, to buy things we don't need, to impress people we don't like. And we've got to get out of that mentality. In terms of the transit versus cars, this again is an example of the public good versus the private profit. Okay, the car companies, who's going to make money on transit? Okay, that's something that has to be provided. It has to be an infrastructure provided by the public. Okay, which means it's money. It's money that's going into something that is absolutely the best thing to do. No doubt about that at all. But those with the money don't want to give it up, and they are going to make more money by making electric vehicles. So this is part of the problem that we're up against within capitalism. Just what came to mind was, the old saying of what's good for GM is good for America, which is a bit of a fallacy too. One interesting thing is that EV sales are waning of late. Oh, and another thing that came to mind, so what does that mean? Hopefully people will be using transit more, and hopefully we'll make the proper investments into that. What came to mind, because I've thought of this a few years ago, all of a sudden we have all these trucks and no trains. And what struck me is that the transportation companies are using the public infrastructure of roads to transport their goods. So basically, they're using public infrastructure that they don't have to pay for. And if they actually ship things by trains, which would be much better environmentally and otherwise, they would have to invest in what that infrastructure is. Even though it's public, it's more targeted, if you will. Roads are everywhere. Railways are not. So I think there are similar things there. Let's invest in public transit for the public good, and let's take the money away from these companies that are producing private vehicles. Population, and yes, John, absolutely. Control and reduce population. This is something that's fallen by the wayside. One thing we have to recognize, though, when we say that, is in terms of the environment, the environmental destruction that we per capita in the Western world and in the Northern world cause compared to the population in the southern and poorer countries. So it has to be looked at not just in terms of individuals, the number of individuals, but what it is that each one of those individuals contributes to global warming. So, and we have to have reduction, I think, in all kinds of terms, okay? And whenever we talk about the economy shrinking, one of the things is, how is the economy measured? It's measured by GNP, right? So whenever that's the measurement, I often refer to a book by Elizabeth Waring. She studied under John Kenneth Galbraith and she wrote a book called If Women Counted. One of the things she brought up in this book is that the Exxon Valdez disaster was, in fact, in terms of economics and the way that we're measuring it, was the most successful oil shipment ever. The reason being that it generated so much economic activity to clean the bloody mess up that it's like a success story, you know, in terms of the economy. But I mean, it's a total disaster. And there are so many things. Look at the wars that are happening now, and the kind of economic activity which concentrate which constitutes to growth. Yeah, which constitutes to growth, but it's not growth; it's destruction. So we really have to take a look at how we're measuring these things. We have to ask more: what growth for what? And there is a degrowth movement out there, which is kind of interesting. And I'll sum it up. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, can you still hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, because I've lost everything off my screen, but at least you can hear me. I've got no picture, just the word Zoom across my screen. Okay, so I can't see anybody's hands up. So Carrie, if you can see the screen, please let me know
No
if there's
hands.
somebody.
No
Okay,
hands. Just 3
you're the,
chat questions.
yes, but I'm just wondering if there's anybody in person that would like to speak. If you can see any hands up, Flo, please go to them first, like 1 or 2, and then a question from the chat. If
Okay,
there's
I
no
don't.
hands, okay, thank you. Sorry about this, but I have nothing in front of me, just an empty screen. So go ahead, Flo, from the chat. Thank you.
Okay, so I had a comment that I kind of wanted to get. Oh, are you sneaking another question in there, Barry? Okay, yes, all right. Oh, and we got another
Okay.
one from
I'm
Gary.
back.
Okay. So Gary has his hand up. Barry put in a question in the chat. I had
And Hans just put his hand up as well. So maybe we could go to them and then one question from the chat.
sure.
Okay,
Oh.
so we'll go with Gary, then Hans, and then Flo is now going to read a question from the chat.
No? Okay. So from the chat, here's one. I'll go with it's my question. What are your thoughts on how big agriculture is now used as a weapon of global coercion and imperialism? Do you think it was a purposeful process, and how has it evolved and developed since the post-World War era and the discourse on farmers that we see in classical Marxist theory?
Okay, thank you, Flo. Is that it?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to go to Stephen, then Tom, and then Angela, and we give them 6 minutes each. And now I will take the first question from Gary.
Okay, I had just a few random comments. One is I really appreciated all the presentations. I think they were excellent, very informative. I'm not quite as negative as Stephen is about the working class. I think the working class has always been forced to operate within the framework provided to it by the ruling class, and which is imposed by force. So until you develop a revolutionary leadership opening the door to different options for the working class has been trying to stay alive within the framework it's presented with. That's one point. The second point is I certainly agree that the propaganda about small nukes, if you take a look at the sponsors of it, it's really big business. There's a lot of money to be made by it. Russia, for example, offers a program to the global south where they will come, determine your needs, build the plant, and erect the plant, operate the plant, and decommission the plant, and you don't have to worry about it. That doesn't mean that they've solved the problem of what you do with the nuclear waste, because nobody has. But you know, Russia can make a lot of money out of it. So that's that. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, when you're considering a loan and you're in the global south, one of their rules is that you can't grow your own food. That sounds ridiculous, and it is ridiculous, but that is one of their rules. And what that does is force your market open to Cargill and Maple Leaf and so on. And so it's really just, it acts as an instrument for the global massive cartels that use every technology they can find, including forcing people not to grow their own food and therefore reducing local reliance, which is criminal in its impact. One of the things that is, in terms of population, we have to become aware of the fact the population has almost peaked and that we're going to see a fairly significant decline. For example, forecasts. I was reading an article that I got from Barry Weisletter on the degrowth plan for China, which is currently the world's largest emitter. It also, by the way, is one of the world leaders in terms of evolving technology and production facilities and making available not only the most, but the best quality types of green technology. But population in China is expected to decline over, I forget whether it's 20 years or 30 years, to 770 million. That is half of what its current population is. What they show is that if the more freedom women have, the fewer children they bear, and it drops down to about 1 per woman, which will cut the population in half. So population demand on the resources of the earth is going to move in our favor, and it's not by forcing people, it's not by genocide or anything like that. It's just by educating women and giving them an access to jobs, which we all want. So it'll be a natural population curve, which I believe will help us immensely and is a very positive part of the future. So I'll leave it there and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Hans, 3 minutes.
Well, I'll pick up on that same theme. For most of the global south, their old age pension resides in the number of offspring they produce. And that is under the existing system of neocolonialism in the absence of a socialist type of safety net for older people. Nowhere is this more dramatically visible than in the world's largest slum, Kibera, in Nairobi, where sub-Saharan climate change has produced an enormous refuge of former agriculturally active people that are now buying junk food from a little sideshow kiosk under a tar paper shack. But it's produced by Nestle and their American equivalent. That is the trend, and it's been irreversible under neoliberalism and global capitalism. I just wanted to highlight that. That is the future. We in the global north are seeing a decline, especially among young people, who in this horrendous housing crisis, economic crisis, automation crisis, we haven't mentioned that, under the job security that we face, insecurity that we face, the young people especially, are questioning whether they're going to have children. What a more extreme expression of the crisis that we're facing is that? And if anybody else wants to answer that, I want to thank all the panelists for the diligent work they've done. And this has been one of the most productive sessions that I've had the privilege of listening to. So thank you all.
Thank you. The question was already read from the chat. So now we're going to go to Stephen, to Tom, and to Angela. Stephen?
Hi. Okay, thank you. Mostly I'm going to leave the question regarding agriculture to Tom. But yeah, industrial farming, I mean, it has a big lobby, and I think it's led to the sorts of things that Gary points out about uh, loans to the global south. I mean, it's just ridiculous. They can't grow their own food. And of course, control over farming just in general, which I think Tom mentioned about how, having monocultures and the devastation that has wreaked on so many countries that are caught in this capitalist mess um, for food production and agricultural products in general. So Gary, just to Gary's point, yeah, I don't disagree. I felt like when I was putting this together, saying that it's all happening within capitalism, we know that, and I was trying to think of an approach or a view to take that would kind of challenge us a little bit. I think it's just too easy to debunk capitalism, and so I could go on for time and speak on that. But I think that as a working class, we have to kind of take a look and not just say, okay, this is what it is, but how do we move? This is on eco-socialism. I see eco-socialism as a step that we can take as socialists. We're in a in existential crisis right now, and I do think that eco-socialism sort of challenges us into reevaluating what it is to be a socialist and how to achieve the kind of what is necessary in the world. That's what I'd say. So I'm definitely not opposed to the things that you were saying. Hans, about the no kids thing, yeah, it's a shame, but I mean, we've got an economic system and an environment that are not sustainable. And so people are looking at that going like, well, young kids, or young people, I should say, saying that they don't want kids. Now, the interesting thing, the flip side of that is that, our economy requires more kids in order to keep growing. And I don't know, I mean, we just can't do that, can we? So, um, I don't think I have much more to say on those points.
Okay. So, who's up next? Tom. Go ahead.
Yeah, some great points. I don't have too much extra to say. On the military as a user of fossil fuels, I don't have I have the numbers on this, but I know that Tamara, Lorenz, and others have done a lot of good work on quantifying that. Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs when you think of capitalism, late capitalism. Now, the most profitable product is weaponry and ammunition, and particularly ammunition is immediately destroyed or very quickly destroyed shortly after it's produced, especially if you have a number of active wars going on, which has been feature of this last half century. So that's yeah, they don't have to worry about redundancy or anything like that. It's a miracle profit center for them, and it's destroying the planet not only through the use of fossil fuels but through land that will never be able to be farmed again, and so on. This issue of the I guess the same answer for a couple questions. Agriculture is the agri corporations being agents of imperialism and the sort of the avant-garde of imperialism. I totally agree. It's interesting though. So they do destroy and ban local production. Trade agreements are based on that, and loans and so on. And this creates a huge surplus population. They've been driven off the land. They have no way to sustain themselves. And now what's imperialism doing? Well, they're stealing these people not only did we take their products, we now are taking the people themselves and exporting them to other countries for cheap labor, which seems to be sort of the ultimate in imperialism in terms of stealing resources. Let's see if there's anything else I had to say. Yeah, well, it leads. I read an article recently, not an article, but I guess part of a book I was reading. But capital needs fewer workers now. I don't think it's correct anymore to say that as production expands, they're going to need more workers. No, they're needing less and less. I mean, China's certainly aware of that and factoring that into their planning. There is sadly, there's just a growing number or portion of the population that capital they need them to be consumers, but they don't need them to be workers. Just speaks to the level of automation and so on.
Okay, Angela?
Yeah, just a few things that come to mind. Thanks, Gary, for your point about propaganda. Like the last couple of years, the industry has pumped so much money into there's a very strong nuclear lobby in this province. OPG, Bruce Power, Ontario Power Workers Union, or the Power Workers Union, do I have that right?
Yeah.
Power Workers Union. I'm not saying that right. It's not. Anyways, you know what I mean. But there's so much money that's out there right now and going into the universities, and that the media has really bought is so much advertisement and the mainstream media relies on that advertisement. So they're not being as critical as they might otherwise be if they weren't like capitalist media profit companies. And so it's so hard to, cut through that. And we're sending in op-eds and constantly press releases, and we just can't compete with the public relations firms that are working for the nuclear industry right now. So it's really David and Goliath battle. But think about how much money these corporations have, and a few people mentioned labor. Stephen mentioned it, like, why isn't labor more engaged in the energy file? And it's because I think there's 10,000 nuclear workers on the Sunshine List in Ontario. So they're all making, like, even cleaners are making over 100 grand. And most of them are making like they're all 6-digit, but going way up from there. And so there's a lot of jobs on the line. And, we say, well, we're going to be needing those nuclear workers for decades to deal with the waste and also transitioning to a green energy future. We're going to, just like the OPG workers that worked in the coal plants, they transitioned to other sectors of OPG's fiefdom. And so there's a lot of money in this industry. And when you think that the Ontario government is committing us to spend upwards of $177 billion, those industries are fighting for those jobs, and they're pumping money in, and so it's like, what do we have? We're volunteers. The anti-nuclear community is like, we're just so outgunned that so that's why I think labor, like even the NDP, I mean, there was an event that was being organized by a couple of NDP MPPs who you all know recently, and it was they put out a webinar, and they start advertising, and basically it was, how do we phase out gas and nuclear and move to a renewable future? And they just got like hammered, not because of the phase out gas work, but because of the phase out nuclear work. And, there's a huge contingent of pro-nuclear people that have bought into this agenda within the NDP, within the Green Party. You know, it's really polarized, and it's really shifting, because in the past it was the NDP, like it was Bob Rae's government that shut down. I think there were new reactors being planned for Darlington, and that ended with Bob Rae's government. No more nuclear plants got built. So, but I think that may be shifting. And just one comment also about capitalism and green energy. We see, like, it's the provincial government that's putting public money behind these nuclear plans. Like, no nuclear reactors are being built by the private sector. All private money is going into renewables, wind and solar. And so, like, capitalism is investing in wind and solar. Capitalism is like only socialized governments like France, Russia, China, Canada, they're the ones that are propping up the nuclear industry. And if we had a free market in the energy sector in Ontario, we would have a renewable future. And the only reason we don't is because government is saying no to that and yes to nuclear and gas. So I think that's all I wanted to add.
Please unmute.
Sorry about that. Yes, we have one question left in the chat. I will go to flow for it because we're also running out of time. So we will give each panelist 3 minutes to answer the question. And we'll start with Angela, then Stephen, and then Tom. Flo, if you could read the question, please.
Okay. Last question is from Barry. Is the military the biggest user of fossil fuels, the biggest waste creator? Doesn't that point to the need to eliminate military spending? Canada out of NATO, disband NATO.
Okay, so Angela, you have 3 minutes.
I don't think I want to address that. I'm sure the military is the biggest spender, or is the biggest user of fossil fuels. And they don't have to account for their emissions with, all the international agreements. They're exempt from claiming their emissions. But as for getting out of NATO, I can't comment on that. I think, if NATO was not, this is probably really controversial within this community of socialists, but I think NATO is preventing imperialist Russia from taking over a lot more territory. And, yeah, so I'm not part of the Canada out of NATO camp these days. I might have been in the past aligned with the peace movement on that front, but I'm not anymore.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Stephen, 3 minutes.
Yeah, so I thought that was a question I missed, and so I answered it in the chat. But yeah, and I appreciate, Angela, this is one of the problems whenever we have a conflict like what's happening in Ukraine right now. It tends to divide us into these two different sides. But if we look historically back at the agreement, oh dear, the name of it escapes me right now, with Gorbachev, and the idea that NATO was not going to expand past a unified Germany. We have to take a look at what NATO has done. Perhaps in its foundation, there was a reason for it, and I think that that's quite arguable. But of late, it's been really an arm of the US military and industrial complex, and military-industrial complex. And it's certainly expanding beyond what it said it would expand, is creating more tension than it is alleviating. And I often wonder, because Putin, I'm not a fan of Putin, don't get me wrong, but about that column of tanks that sat there for days, I'm not sure even how many days, before it actually attacked Kyiv. And Putin apparently is a chess player. And I've never heard a reasonable explanation. You know, I heard something like, well, they ran out of gas. That doesn't sound very reasonable. I wonder if he was sitting there as a threat to say, look, we're here. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to back down? And they didn't back down. Nothing happened. So, you know, really, NATO should have been disbanded in 1991. Russia should have become a part of Europe, and those the negotiations, if you will, and the alignment. Instead, what do we have? This continued problem. So a new Cold War that never really got to, you know, really came to an end, I guess, in a way. Yeah, military is horrible. We have to overcome. One of the things, I should be quiet, I'm rambling now, but there's a movie called The World Is My Country.
Please,
And it's about, and it's about getting rid of national boundaries and really unifying the world so that we do not kill each other in wars. And I think it's worth watching. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Tom? You're muted, Tom.
Sorry, I think I partially answered this question already from I guess I saw it in the chat. At any rate, I'm certainly opposed to all the imperialist wars, the U.S. wars in particular, which you know, there's different types, right? Drone wars, assassination wars, sanction wars, blockades, military coups. And Canada's been involved in far too many of these. There's a book just out from Eve Engler that talks about Canada being involved, I believe, in 27 coups in the last few decades. We're major players. We should get out of NATO. NATO should be abolished. It's a threat to world peace. War in Ukraine is a NATO proxy war. Yeah, this has a big impact on the needless loss of lives just to for NATO to keep up its aggressive military stance. So yeah, I don't see any need for it. In fact, it's beyond the topic of this discussion, but it'd be worthwhile looking back at the time of the establishment of NATO. Lester Pearson played a very big role in doing that. Canada's been involved right from the beginning, and it was always seen as a way of participating in the Cold War. There may have been a few months at the beginning that somehow people, you know, had some altruistic motivations for it, but it very quickly evolved into an agent for U.S. imperialist ambitions.
Okay, thank you, Tom. In fact, thanks to everyone, and a special thanks to all of our panelists. And also thank you to our political producer, Barry, and to our tech producers, Kiri in Toronto and Flo in British Columbia. Socialist Action is celebrating the 30th anniversary of our party this year. Folks who wish to join, please note that Socialist Action Convention will be held in person in Toronto and online on Saturday, June 15th. If you wish to join SA and to attend this convention, please let us know as soon as possible. Just call 647-986-1917. For more information about Socialist Action conferences, forums, film nights, and study groups held throughout the year, please send your phone number and email address to us at the SA website, www.socialistaction.ca. So once again, thank you all for being with us today. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Bye for now.